we now push towards the arts as an agent for social change, opening up with our keynote speaker, Lu Kemp, whose theatre making has shone a light on the issues facing us in old age. It's an absolute pleasure to have Lu Kemp with us, so please give her a very warm welcome.
Hello. I'm not entirely sure who I'm speaking to, so I hope that I will pitch this into the right area. I have no idea whether you have worked in social change or indeed what your relationship to the arts is, but I'm a theatre maker by trade, usually a sort of semi-conventional theatre maker working in black boxes on main stages. And I was asked to talk to you about my experience of making Have Your Circumstances Change with Artangel earlier this year, or actually earlier last year. And in line with your broad theme about the arts as an agent for social change. And to me, the arts can be nothing but an agent for social change. That is my reason for making work as an artist. So it's a kind of interesting premise. And what I seek to do is to identify errors and vulnerabilities and flaws in our systems, and then to expose them through work. And expose them in conversation with an audience in a kind of playful way. So the Artangel piece was very far from a main stage, straightforward theatre piece. It was, as you probably know about Artangel, they are largely visual arts producers. So part of what they ask of an artist is to do a piece of work with them that could never take place with any other company. So to push you deliberately beyond your boundaries, which is interesting and terrifying given how public the work is. One of the themes that engages me particularly at the moment is old age and aging, and has done for the last sort of 3 years. Britain, and this is quite funny talking to an audience who are very young, but Britain is getting older, much older, and extreme old age is the fastest growing section of our population at the moment. 1 in 5 of us will live to over 100. And there was a House of Lords Select Committee report in 2013, probably will, which said the UK population is aging rapidly, but we have concluded that the government and our society are woefully underprepared, that there has been a collective failure to address the implications. And that's really interesting to me. So what happens now? How do we as a society change to meet this need? When the state pension was brought in over 100 years ago in 1908, only 5% of the population reached an age old enough to draw it. Whereas now, it would be quite surprising, or you would be considered to have died an early death if you didn't reach the age of retirement. And in 2011 census, 1 in 6 people in the UK were over 65. So you can only imagine that that figure has increased since then. So we've got this massive booming population. We even talk about now the youngest old and the oldest old. And if that is true, then what happens post the age of retirement? We might have 1/3 of our lives to live after we've retired. And under Conservative government, there is less and less provision for that age group. So between the point where you fall out of the system, where you leave work or you stop being involved in raising families, and the point of crisis, which tends to be where the state intervenes again, you could completely disappear off the map. And it is a generalization, but I don't think an incorrect generalization, that women tend to stay more involved. They tend to involve themselves in community groups, they tend to stay out in the public eye, whereas men tend to become more isolated as they age. So I wanted to know what happened to most men after retirement and before they hit the point of what we call crisis, or going into hospital, and the beginnings of death. So in 2012, I was invited into the offices of Artangel for a chat. Does anybody know Artangel here? Does that make some sense to you? It's a big visual arts producing company. They have produced some of the most exciting work by visual artists over the last 20 years. So Rachel White-Reed's House, that took place in East London, which was a winner of the Turner Prize, and they produced Jeremy Deller's The Battle of Orgreave, where he recreated or restaged the battle, the incident in the miners' strike. Clea Bernard, who produced a film called The Arbor, was one of their open submission winners. In fact, the Open is something really worth looking at. It's an enormous prize that is completely open to any artist, and because Artangel have the capacity to commission whoever they like, it really is genuinely open, so I would go have a look at it if I was you. But so part of what they do is what they call these collaborative projects, which have to be created in engagement with a community. So all they asked me was who I would be interested in working in. And my response, of course, at the time, because following my kind of recent period of research, was older age, people in their older age. And the producer I met, Rachel Anderson, who's an amazing producer, was very interested in cooking. And she told me a story about she had met a man who had, after the death of his mother, he had counselled his father through cooking over the phone because his father lived in the north and he was in London. So every night he picked up the phone and they had a cookery session so that his father would eat. And the more we talked to people like Age UK, the more these sort of stories emerged. And so we decided that with St Luke's Community Centre, which is up on Central Street, and Age UK, we were going to set up a series of cooking sessions for men only and teach the basics of cooking. So we recruited an amazing chef who has an incredible and checkered history of cooking for dukes and cooking on cruise liners and so on. And we put the invitation out to older men to come and join us. And I was very relieved when, on the first day of those sessions, about 15 men turned up, because both St Luke's and Age UK have real difficulty engaging men. They tend to come to sessions like the Shed, where they can work with power tools, but they don't tend to come to any other sessions. And we got some really interesting men to come along and work with us. And part of the way that we did that, and I think this is key to this sort of collaborative and social work, is that we provided the safest possible environment for them to engage with us. So I spoke to them frequently in advance of the session. We provided all the transport that they needed to get there. When they were on site, the cooking session was finished each time with a meal, and half of that meal was then given them to take home so that they could freeze it or eat it later in the week. And initially we also gave them the ingredients for the meal so they might practice. However, we stopped doing that because people weren't doing it, and I think part of the reason for that is nobody wants to eat chicken curry 3 times a week. So we sort of learned as we went along, and the men who came had some really interesting stories in relationship to food and to why they didn't cook themselves. So we had a man called Colm, who was a huge Irish man with these incredible thick fingers. And he said to me that his partner, he'd met his partner when he was in his 30s, and his partner was in his 20s, that this partner of his, this younger man, had always done all of the cooking and then had relatively recently died. And Colm had walked into the kitchen, and he said he had this panic attack when he looked at the oven and he didn't know how to open it. And there was Stan, who was 93 years old, and Stan said the only thing he'd ever cooked was cereal, and that he alternated between 2 different types of cereal, and that he had eaten at the same cafe. And I find this really hard to believe, but he did repeat the story several times, that he'd eaten at the same cafe every day since the war. And at that point I did say, well, which war? But indeed, he was talking about the Second World War, so we calculated the number of meals that he must have eaten at this same cafe since that moment. We had a lot of men who had come to Britain, so they had stories that related to where they'd come from. So Cyril had travelled to Jamaica, from Jamaica as a very young man, and inevitably had very particular associations with food because of that. We had Babatunde from Nigeria and Valdemar from Belarus. And over the period of cooking, partly because cooking is a very structured activity and it creates space, the men started to relax and they started to talk and to enjoy that way of communicating. We were very clear with the group right from the beginning that what we were involved in was making a piece of art, and that we didn't know what that would be or who it would involve, but that they would be collaborating with us on that project. So this was back in 2012-13, and then at the end of 2013-14, I hope I'm getting this right, no, 14-15, we repeated the cookery sessions, so a year later, so shift all those dates forward. And a lot of the men came back, which was a real surprise to me, and a real honour, actually. And we also had new people come in. So we had a gentleman, Tony, a Scottish man, who had dementia. I was amazed to see the return of William Bunker, who had had a really awful turn during the first year, a turn to the point where I thought we might lose him mid-session. And he arrived the following year, fitter than he'd been the previous one. And at the same time, alongside these sessions, we started to work at St. Bart's on Mile End and to take cookery sessions into hospitals. And this felt like a really radical act, strangely. And I was really surprised by how that felt, because you go into this place which is all white clean and sterilized, and you're cracking eggs and chopping herbs and getting fluid on the floor. And of course, the men that we worked with at St. Bart's were a lot less able than the men at St. Luke's Community Centre, so the act of cracking an egg or whisking was really quite challenging for them. And we had a gentleman there called John, who had been discovered after 3 days in the bath in stone cold water because he'd broken his hip and was unable to get out. And so the experience of working at St. Bart's in that way kind of informed me about a different sort of isolation to the isolation that the men at St. Luke's were experiencing. Artangel only work site specifically. They're not interested in making work for theatres or galleries, so they set out to find a space for us to create the work in, and the space leads the work, and so until you have a space, the work can't take a form. Can I just check my time so I know where I am? 10 minutes, brilliant. Okay, that's perfect. So we went through a whole different lot of venues. Originally, we were looking at a drill hall on Mile End, and had we worked in the drill hall, we would have involved all the men from the cookery classes in performance and brought them together with professional performers. I mean, the drill hall was wonderful. It had a basketball court, it had a pub, it had a room full of what looked like psychiatrists' couches. And the NH Trust, who owned the drill hall, were very keen for us to work with them, but that fell through. So the second place that we investigated was working in McDonald's in London Bridge, because that's about to be turned into a science centre, and we thought we'd do a subversive meal where everybody came in, lined up, queued up, did their kind of capitalist relationship to food, and then by the end they find that they're in the middle of a large feast. But that didn't work. About a month, well, just a couple of months before we were due to make the piece, we still had no space. And so the only thing for me to do was to start to imagine. And during this period, I had been going into the men's homes, going and having coffee with them, and I was really struck by the difference in their spaces. So we had John, not the John from Mile End Hospital, but John from St. Luke's, who had made the incredibly brave move of moving from South London to East London into a new flat because he had a complicated relationship with alcohol, and he felt that only by breaking all of his old ties could he begin again. And so going into John's home was a very particular experience of a place without narrative at all. And by contrast to William Bunker, who had lived all his life pretty much in the same flat in Islington, or house in Islington, with his partner Lu, who died years before, and his house was just full of the narrative of their lives. And that story began to work itself out on me, and I began to imagine 3 different spaces, a kitchen, a living room, and a bathroom, and 3 different times of our lives, just post-retirement, early retirement, mid-retirement, and the end, where we approach death, and to look at those spaces as morning, noon, and night, and the possibility of creating a kind of triptych of work that followed the everyday actions of a man through this space, but then to mess with that and to treat that playfully so that we start to look at the intimate details of what a life of isolation might look like. And originally I spoke to Artangel as we didn't have a site, about putting those in 3 different places across London, that we would build a kind of glass box where the audience was able to look into, an observation box, listen into, but the men were in control of the space. And that eventually worked its way out into, we got the keys to a space in Archway. And actually, how do I do this? I can probably show you the space to begin with, I think. Aha, there you are. So it's just outside Archway Tube. It's an old fad shop, an old furniture shop, and we decided to build these observation boxes into the furniture shop. So on the left-hand side was the first space. On the right-hand side, you can see the second space, and then you went inside into the third space, the bathroom. So during the time that we didn't have a space, I started to work with 3 professional actors and 3 young boys to explore the ideas of kitchen, living room, bathroom, and a lot of details. They were incredibly generous, the actors. They were all older men, they were all over 80. Incredibly generous with the details of aging and what it meant to them. And one of my favourite moments in the workshops was with Dudley Sutton and Mitchell Jelly. We were looking at how you brush your teeth. And Mitchell, who's 9 years old, is incredibly fastidious about how he brushes his teeth. He has a particular way of doing it. He does a particular number of strokes. And the reason he does this is because he was worried about getting his father's teeth. So the moment we met his father, I was completely intrigued, looking in his mouth, and horrified to realise that his father was 38 and his son was worried about his teeth. And at the same time, you've got Dudley, who's 83, who puts his teeth to soak in Sterident overnight, but also, and demonstrated this in the workshop, he will sometimes just pop his teeth out, wipe them on his trousers, and pop them back in. And I thought that Mitchell was going to throw up. But those sort of details are totally fascinating, and in terms of an insight into the aging body, I think we're generally repulsed by the aging body, and we tend to hide it. Definitely, sort of socially, we like to look at the young body, we like to airbrush things out, we know this. We don't want to look at where we're headed, and that really fascinates me. Looking at Dudley's slack, kind of pullable skin against Mitchell's fine, supple skin, and you'll see this as we come to the photographs. But there's something really amazing about that, putting that contrast up against each other. So I'm gonna go on to showing you some slides, but because we were late in finding the space, I found myself in a position where I had to use professional actors rather than the men themselves, community performers. My experience of making work with non-professionals is you just need to give them a lot of time, and we would have been absolutely up against it. So I was concerned that the men from the cookery classes wouldn't feel an ownership over the piece, and yet when they came to see the final show, their pride in it and their ownership over it made me really proud and made me recognize that they felt totally implicated in what was created. And we all went over to a cafe afterwards and had a big political discussion about the title of the show. And that was very reassuring, I think. So I'm going to talk you through these slides. What I wanted to do was to create an experience for the audience which was at once incredibly intimate and also slightly alienated. So the pieces are all seen, they were about 15 minutes long each. They were all seen through glass, and you were wearing headphones. So the performers had binaural mics in their ears, so you're right up with their sound, the intimate sound of them shaving, of moving their hair, picking their teeth, pulling a very long hair out of their nose. All of that is right up close to you. We also distorted sound. So, for example, in Kitchen, which is probably the most surreal of the 3 pieces, the sound of a man knocking over cornflakes became an avalanche. The radio constantly switched on you. Earth fell out of cupboards. and fish leapt in the sink, and all of that was brought into your sound world as well. Boys disappeared down dustbins. Right, let me have a look at this. So, this is the inside of the fad shop before we got our hands on it. Oh yeah, okay. So we began to build something, this is quite early on during the building stage, that might look like this. And as you can see, this really springs from John's space, in that it is a space where nobody really lives or hasn't yet found their space within. This is a living room, this is mid-retirement, and then finally the bathroom, which was in the dark, so much easiest to control in terms of light. So these are a few shots from rehearsals. It's us fiddling around with a large magnifying mirror. And that's the result of the magnifying mirror, getting very up close to the pores of Dudley's skin. This is what I mean. Dudley is amazing in that he's open to everything, but you could pull his skin into particular positions. And two of them doing their teeth. Okay, and we go into performances. So the performance was for, I think it was about 18 people at a time, and it was partly to do with the amount of headphones we had. That's the Archway Tower. Have your circumstances changed? Does anybody recognise that phrase? It's from social security forms. So you are constantly asked on social security forms, have your circumstances changed? It's the sort of slightly passive-aggressive, angry question that I associate with those forms. And even on your TV license, you'll get it if you say you don't have a TV license. But it's an interesting question, because for all of us all the time, right, our circumstances change. It's just a shot of the headphones and our ushers. So this was on a run-through, I think, an open run-through where we're just testing out the piece. And we begin with kitchen. That's Paul in the kitchen. I should tell you quickly a bit about kitchen. So I'm doing a really bad job of using this mic here. It was most surreal of the pieces, as I said. It begins with a man in early retirement, the beginning of his day, moving through the motions. But he spills his cereal, and that cereal falling becomes an avalanche, and the world breaks and changes, and a boy comes out of the fridge and disappears down a dustbin, and a fish jumps in the sink, and the cupboards explode with earth. And what it is a man learning to make an omelette for the first time. So by the end of the piece, the omelette is made, the opera, which has come through the radio, finishes on the final beat, and the boy disappears with the chicken in his arms, and man sits and makes an omelette. It's a kind of playful way of interpreting what we did with the men, or how the men felt about their work. It's also, in some ways, exploring the beginnings of dementia, because another part of the research that I'm doing, and also in reference to Tony, is about how we begin to see the world when dementia starts to set in. So, with the sound, we tried to capture the sound of the man, but never to capture the sound of the boy. So the boy moved almost silently around the space, despite doing some quite acrobatic things. That's a dustbin. Unfortunately, we don't have a shot of the boy disappearing into the dustbin. He's a young breakdancer, Luca. He plays the boy and can do some incredible things, and it took my breath away every time. There's a fish. It's our third performer. Okay, so living room is mid-retirement. It is while we are still in relatively good health, and it's the only one of the pieces that had a serious amount of text in it. The premise of the piece is a man trying to answer a crossword, but he gets distracted from one task to the next and led on an enormous journey before he gets back to finally answering that crossword. And it's also a dialogue with the TV, so the man is constantly talking to the TV. He can't think of the answer to the crossword, but he has every answer to 15 to 1 and Mastermind, and John Humphreys played a surprise appearance for us in that. And the generation game, so the whole thing culminates with the generation game. where his cabinet at the back of the room lit up with lights and started moving things across it, objects, and dropping into the bin next to them. So that's Roddy, alone. The boy appears, in each of the pieces, the boy appears in a surprising way. And in this one, he comes through the wall during a football game, and they start to play football between them across the space. But as soon as the man gets his hand on the football, it deflates. This is the boy coming in again through the window for a poker game. I really loved the relationship that the boys and the men developed. It was a very special thing to observe. Okay. And finally, bathroom. So the audience were led into the darkness for bathroom. It was the longest of the pieces. Here you are. We messed around with bathroom with sound, again, in a different way. So the whole thing starts with a very dulled sound. As soon as Dudley puts on his glasses, as you can see there, it goes into sharper focus. And then we reverse that playfully with the boy, so that when the boy puts on the glasses later, his sound becomes dulled, and when he takes it off, it comes sharp again. I'm really interested in people's kitchen medical cabinets. I think there's a history to be found always within them. In all of the cases, the man never saw the boy. The boy saw the man, but the man didn't see the boy. So they aided and abetted and caused mischief within the space. And I suppose the question of the piece is, who is the boy in relationship to the narrative of the man's life? This is Mitchell underwater in terms of sound. The end of bathroom finished with Mitchell, the boy, washing Dudley's hair. He modelled it into kind of punk haircuts. And this is the only moment in any of the pieces that the performers actually directly interacted, where they looked into each other's eyes before Mitchell disappeared. And Dudley is left on his own at the end in the bath as the lights go down, which I suppose is a bit of an elegy to John. Okay. So to conclude, social change. I hope in a very concrete way that we had an impact on the lives of the men who attended the cookery class. I would love, if it was possible, that class continued, but that's not the work that I do. And as we know, the amount of cuts that are happening at the moment, it's very unlikely that those sort of classes will be funded. But I hope that it had an impact on where they are now, both in terms of skills and also in opening up a social relationship for them. I can't measure the impact of have your circumstances changed on audiences, but I do believe that change takes place through beginning a conversation. So the beginning of feminism didn't happen with the suffragettes, it happened hundreds of years earlier, maybe thousands of years earlier, with women asking the question of what if we were equal, what if things were different? And that it's crucial to start to have those conversations so we can address where we're going. And old age is interesting, it's particular, in that in most areas of social progression, the group that suffers marginalization will be the group that instigates change. But with old age, they are the army of the old are vulnerable to attrition and do not have the time to change things. Only we that are old are aging, and that is all of us, can make a change. Thank you.